3,000 ships anchored in a single harbor. At the same time, picture that. The Penobscot River at Bangor, Maine in 1860, packed so tight with lumber schooners that people claimed you could walk from Bangor to Brewer across their decks without touching water. The harbor wasn't just crowded, it was functionally impossible. Ships waiting 3 weeks to load, captains bribing dock workers for priority. Lumber stacked 20 feet high on every available wharf. And still the logs kept coming, down the Penobscot River, millions of board feet every single day from forests 100 miles north. This wasn't a port. This was the end destination of every river drive in Maine, the terminus of every winter ice road, the place where every log that survived the spring floods, the jams, the drownings, the chaos, ended up. Bangor, Maine. Between 1832 and 1888, this single port shipped 8.7 billion board feet of lumber. That's billion. With a B enough to build every house in New York City. Twice. All shipped through one port, all loaded by hand, all processed by 150 sawmills that ran 24 hours a day and killed workers at a rate that made newspapers stop publishing the details. Northern Maine, 1830. The forests are what people notice first when they arrive. Not scattered groves, not manageable woodlands, an ocean of white pine stretching in every direction as far as you can see. Trees 60, 70, 80 feet tall, diameter of 3 feet, 4 feet, trunks so straight they look machined. This is what brought the lumber barons, Samuel Vesey, Abner Coburn, Rufus Dwinell, Ira Wadley. These weren't men who dabbled in lumber. They were capitalists who saw a resource and built an industrial machine to extract it. Vesey alone owned 80 sawmills, a bank, a railroad, thousands of acres of timberland, and enough political power that when Bangor tried to raise his taxes, he successfully petitioned the state legislature to create his own town, Vesey, so he wouldn't have to pay them. That's the scale we're talking about. That's the wealth the lumber industry generated. And all of it flowed through one geographic bottleneck, Bangor's harbor. Here's why Bangor became the lumber capital of the world. Geography, specifically the Penobscot River. The Penobscot Drainage Basin covers 8,600 square miles of northern and eastern Maine. Nearly every major forest in the state drains into it. The river's 109 miles long from Medway to Penobscot Bay, but including all its branches, West Branch, East Branch, tributaries, feeder streams, the system totals over 264 miles of navigable waterway during spring floods. This meant logs cut anywhere in northern Maine could be floated to Bangor. No railroads needed, no roads required, just gravity, water, and men willing to ride the flood. But here's the critical feature. Bangor sits at the head of navigation, 30 miles upriver from the Atlantic. Tidal waters reach Bangor. Ocean-going vessels can sail directly to the city's docks, but above Bangor, rapids make ship navigation impossible. This makes Bangor the last point where you can transfer logs from river to ship. Everything upstream has to come here. There's no alternative. It's a natural choke point. And the lumber barons exploited it ruthlessly. The process worked like this. At winter, logging camps throughout northern Maine cut timber. Thousands of men, dozens of operations, all focused on the same goal: get logs to the nearest river or tributary before spring. The logs are stacked on frozen riverbanks, millions of them. By March, the accumulation is staggering. Then April comes. The ice breaks. The snow melts. Water levels rise 5, 10, 15 feet, and the drive begins. River pigs follow the logs downstream, breaking jams, guiding the flow, drowning with depressing regularity. The logs travel 50, 80, 100 miles through rapids, over waterfalls, around bends that create jams requiring dynamite to break. By late April or early May, the logs reach Bangor. Not hundreds, not thousands, millions of board feet, all arriving within a few weeks, all needing to be sorted, processed, and shipped before the next drive starts. The logistics are insane. The economic pressure is enormous, and the entire system depends on a single infrastructure, the Penobscot boom. The boom is a sorting facility. Picture it, a massive series of wooden structures built across the Penobscot River north of Bangor, designed to catch logs as they float downstream. The boom spans the entire river width, uses chains, pilings, floating barriers. Its purpose? Stop the logs. Let workers sort them by owner. Distribute them to the appropriate mills. Because here's the problem. Dozens of logging operations use the same river. Company A's logs are mixed with Company B's logs. There's no way to tell them apart except for end marks, brands stamped on each log identifying the owner. So as logs arrive at the boom, workers with peavies and pike poles grab them, read the marks, and sort them into different sections. Then mill owners buy their sorted logs and tow them to their sawmills. This process handles millions of board feet per week during peak season. It's organized chaos. It's also brilliant engineering. The Penobscot boom made large-scale lumbering possible. Before the boom, companies couldn't coordinate. After it was built in the 1820s, Bangor exploded. Sawmills multiplied, the port boomed, and the lumber barons got very, very rich. Now let's talk about the mills themselves. By 1860, Bangor operated 150 sawmills along the Penobscot and Kenduskeag rivers. That's not an estimate, that's documented, 150 separate facilities. Some small operations with a single saw. Others massive complexes employing hundreds, all water-powered, all running constantly during the shipping season. The mills clustered densely in adjacent communities. Bangor, Orono, Old Town, Milford, Bradley. You could stand in one spot and see a dozen mills operating simultaneously. The noise was unbelievable. Gang saws, multiple blades cutting simultaneously, ripping through white pine logs 3 feet in diameter. The sound of wood being torn apart at industrial scale is distinct. It's not a clean cutting noise, it's violent. The saws scream, the logs crack, the machinery pounds, and it never stops. 24 hours a day during peak season, shift after shift. The mills had to run constantly to process the volume arriving from upriver. Working in these mills was extraordinarily dangerous. This was before OSHA, before safety regulations, before anyone cared whether workers lived or died as long as production continued. The machinery was exposed. Gang saws with unprotected blades turning at speed that could slice through a 3-foot log in minutes. Belts, gears, pulleys, all moving rapidly, all within reach. The noise so loud you couldn't hear warnings. Men working 12 to 14-hour shifts in conditions that guaranteed accidents. Injuries were daily occurrences. Deaths were common enough that they rarely made the newspaper unless particularly dramatic. There's a documented case from Milltown, Maine, not Bangor, but similar mill operation, of a worker named James Hicks. His injury record tells you everything about sawmill work in the 1890s. Hicks had the toes of his right foot amputated, then the toes of his left foot, then his entire left foot. He was mangled in a lathe machine, struck by bolts flying from saws, nearly killed, ribs crushed by slabs from a bolting machine, nose broken, and scalp partly torn off when he was drawn over a pulley, back and shoulder scalded in a boiler explosion. Other injuries of more or less importance, eventually lost his right foot and was incapacitated from further work in sawmills. James Hicks worked in sawmills until his body literally fell apart, and he was considered lucky because he survived. Wages in the mills were low, very low, given the danger. In the 1880s and 1890s, sawmill workers earned between $1.50 to $2.50 per day depending on skill level. That's roughly $48 to $80 per day in modern money, for 12 to 14-hour shifts. Doing work that could kill you if you made a single mistake. Unions weren't allowed to organize. When workers struck for better pay or conditions, the lumber barons simply ignored them until the workers were destitute, then allowed them back, sometimes at reduced wages. If water was low or logs weren't available, workers were told to go home and pray for rain. No pay, no job security. Just show up when called and hope you don't lose a limb. The lumber barons colluded to keep wages low. They had no interest in improving safety or working conditions. Labor was cheap. Workers were replaceable. The timber had to move. That's all that mattered. If you're the kind of person who believes these stories deserve to be remembered, hit subscribe. This channel exists because people like you refuse to let history be forgotten. The men who worked these mills, who died in these mills, who lost limbs and kept working until they physically couldn't anymore, they never expected to be remembered. But you're still here. You're listening. That tells me something about you. If you think these stories matter, if you believe the men who built America's lumber industry deserve better than to be erased from history, subscribe. Let's make sure their sacrifice is never forgotten. Now, back to the harbor. 3,000 ships. Let's understand what that means. In 1860 alone, a single year, 3,300 lumber vessels passed through Bangor's docks. That's 9 ships per day, every single day, for 12 months. Each ship needed to be loaded, by hand. Lumber had to be carried from the mills to the wharves, stacked on the docks, then loaded onto the ships piece by piece. A typical lumber schooner could carry 150,000 to 200,000 board feet. Larger vessels could handle 300,000. Loading took days, sometimes a week, depending on the ship size and crew availability. And there were 3,300 ships that year. Do the math. That's 495 million to 660 million board feet of lumber, minimum, shipped in 1860 alone. The official record says 150 million board feet annually during peak years. But those numbers don't account for the ships that loaded and left between surveys, or the timber shipped as masts, spars, specialty lumber that wasn't counted in standard board feet measurements. The actual volume was almost certainly higher. Picture the harbor during peak season, May through September. The spring drives have delivered logs. The mills are running at maximum capacity. Processed lumber is piling up on every available dock. Ships are arriving constantly. Some from Boston, others from New York, Philadelphia, Charleston. Vessels heading to the Caribbean to trade lumber for sugar and molasses. Ships bound for California during the gold rush, carrying Maine pine to build San Francisco. Each captain wants to load fast and leave, but there aren't enough docks. There isn't enough dock crew. There isn't enough wharf space. So ships anchor in the river, in lines, waiting their turn. During the absolute peak in the 1850s and 60s, eyewitnesses reported that the Penobscot River was so packed with anchored ships that you could see masts for a mile in both directions, decks touching, crews shouting across to neighboring vessels, the claim that you could walk across ship decks from Bangor to Brewer without touching water. That's not myth, that's documented observation from multiple sources. The harbor was that crowded. Loading lumber onto ships was backbreaking work. This is before cargo cranes, before forklifts, before mechanized handling of any kind. Everything moved by human muscle and basic tools. Dock workers, called longshoremen, would carry boards from the lumber piles to the ship, either on their shoulders or using 2-man carries for heavier timbers. They'd pass the lumber up to ship crews who'd stack it in the holds, arranging it carefully to maximize cargo and prevent shifting during the voyage. A single ship loading 200,000 board feet meant moving individual pieces totaling that volume. If the boards were standard 1-inch by 12-inch by 16-foot planks, that's over 12,000 individual boards, carried, one at a time, or in bundles if workers were strong enough, for days, in all weather. The longshoremen were paid by the day or by the load. Typically $1.50 to $2 per day in the 1860s, about $48 to $64 in modern money. The work was seasonal, available only when ships needed loading. No work in winter, no steady income. Just brutal physical labor when it was available, and nothing when it wasn't. The dock crews worked in teams, usually 6 to 10 men per ship. A foreman coordinated the loading, deciding how to arrange the lumber to balance the vessel properly. Get it wrong, and the ship could list, become unstable, potentially capsize in heavy seas. Get it right, and you could pack in maximum cargo without compromising safety. The foreman earned slightly more, maybe $2.50 to $3 per day, because their skill determined whether the ship made it to port or went down. The actual loading happened in a brutal rhythm. Grab boards, carry them to the gangway, pass them up to the ship crew, return for more boards, repeat, for 12 hours, sometimes 14. The lumber was rough cut. Splinters were constant, hands bled, shoulders bruised from carrying weight, backs strained from lifting hundreds of boards per day. By evening, men could barely stand. They'd return to cramped boarding houses, eat basic meals, sleep, and do it again the next day. For weeks, until the ship was loaded and left. Then wait for the next ship. If you were lucky, there was always another ship. If you weren't, you went without work until shipping picked up again. The competition for loading work was fierce. More men than jobs. Foremen could pick and choose. If you complained about conditions or pay, you were replaced by mourning. If you got injured and couldn't work, someone else took your position. There was no job security, no benefits, no compensation for injuries. You worked until you couldn't, then you starved. That was the deal. The lumber barons knew it. The ship captains knew it. The foremen knew it. Everyone knew it. And the system continued because labor was abundant and desperate. Irish immigrants, German immigrants, men from rural Maine farms with no better options, all willing to destroy their bodies for wages that barely covered rent and food. The harbor needed thousands of these men during peak season. Bangor had them. They lined up each morning hoping to be selected for work. Some days they were, some days they weren't. The lucky ones worked consistently enough to survive. The unlucky ones ended up in poorhouses or moved on to find work elsewhere. Think about the volume for a moment. In 1860, 3,300 ships loaded at Bangor. That's an average of 9 ships per day, every day for 365 days. But loading wasn't evenly distributed. Most happened during shipping season, May through October. That's 6 months, roughly 180 days, which means 3,300 ships in 180 days. That's 18.3 ships per day, on average. Some days more, some days fewer. But picture Bangor's waterfront on a busy day in July 1860, 20 ships being loaded simultaneously, each ship requiring a crew of 6 to 10 longshoremen. That's 120 to 200 dock workers actively loading at any given time, plus mill workers delivering lumber to the docks, plus carters hauling lumber from mills to wharves, plus scalers measuring and documenting the lumber, plus clerks recording shipments, plus ship crews preparing their vessels. Hundreds of men working the waterfront on a single busy day, all orchestrated around one goal: get the lumber loaded and the ships moving. The logistics required coordination that rivaled military operations. And it worked. Mostly. Sometimes ships waited too long and captains got angry. Sometimes lumber piles got mixed up and wrong cargo went to wrong ships. Sometimes accidents happened, boards dropped, workers crushed, ships damaged. But overall, the system functioned. 8.7 billion board feet shipped over 56 years. That's 155 million board feet per year on average. It's staggering when you think about the human labor required to move that volume by hand. The ships themselves were often built in Bangor. The lumber industry needed vessels to transport its product, so shipbuilding became a major secondary industry. Bangor shipyards constructed hundreds of schooners, brigs, and larger vessels throughout the mid-1800s. These weren't small boats. Lumber schooners were typically 100 to 150 feet long. 3 masts, built from Maine oak, pine, and spruce. Ironically, the same timber they'd later carry as cargo. Building a ship required skilled labor: shipwrights, caulkers, riggers, sailmakers. These craftsmen earned better wages than sawmill workers, $3 to $5 per day for master shipwrights, because their skills were irreplaceable. The ships they built were sturdy, functional, and unglamorous, designed to carry maximum cargo with minimum crew. A typical lumber schooner could sail with a crew of 6 to 8 men: captain, first mate, cook, and 4 to 5 able seamen. They'd make runs from Bangor to Boston in 3 to 5 days if the wind was good, longer if it wasn't. The captains were often part owners of their vessels, investing in the ship and cargo to share in profits. Successful captains could become wealthy. Most didn't. Most just earned enough to keep sailing. Where did all this lumber go? Everywhere. Boston and New York were the primary destinations, close enough for quick turnaround, large enough to consume massive quantities. The lumber built the cities of the eastern seaboard. Houses, warehouses, docks, everything. As those cities grew in the mid-1800s, their demand for lumber seemed infinite. Bangor supplied it. But the trade routes extended far beyond the East Coast. Ships carried Maine lumber to Charleston, South Carolina, to Savannah, Georgia, down to the Caribbean, Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad. The Caribbean trade was particularly profitable. Islands that had stripped their own forests for sugar plantations desperately needed timber for buildings, barrels, and shipping. They'd trade sugar, molasses, and rum for Maine lumber. A ship could leave Bangor with lumber, trade it in Barbados for sugar and molasses, sail back to Boston or New York, sell the Caribbean goods at profit, and return to Bangor for another load of lumber. The triangular trade patterns that had defined colonial commerce continued into the 1800s, with Maine lumber as a key commodity. The California Gold Rush created another boom. Starting in 1849, San Francisco needed everything: buildings, docks, infrastructure, built instantly to support the population explosion. Maine lumber ships sailed around Cape Horn, a brutal 14,000-mile journey that took 4 to 6 months to deliver timber to California. The profits were enormous. Lumber that sold for $15 per thousand board feet in Bangor could sell for $200 to $400 per thousand in San Francisco during peak demand. A ship carrying 200,000 board feet could generate $40,000 to $80,000 in San Francisco sales, roughly $1.3 to $2.6 million in modern money, from cargo that cost $3,000 in Bangor. Even accounting for shipping costs, crew wages, and the risk of a 6-month voyage around Cape Horn, the profit margins were absurd. Bangor captains who made successful California runs could retire rich after just a few voyages. Of course, many ships didn't make it. Cape Horn's reputation for storms, high winds, and ship losses was well earned, but the potential profits were so high that captains kept attempting it, and Bangor kept supplying the lumber. These ships established connections that outlasted the lumber boom. Communities in California, Washington, Nevada were named Bangor by Maine natives who'd sailed there with lumber cargoes and decided to stay. The lumber trade wasn't just economic, it was a migration pattern. Young men from Maine would work on lumber ships, see opportunities in the West, and settle there. The lumber industry dispersed Maine's population across the country, creating networks of former Bangor residents in cities from San Francisco to Galveston. This diaspora became important later when Bangor's lumber industry declined. Former residents in other cities helped Bangor transition by providing connections to new industries, new markets, new opportunities beyond timber. The ships that carried lumber also carried people, ideas, showing the seeds of whatever Bangor would become after the trees ran out. Here's what made the system work. The lumber barons controlled everything: timberland, logging operations, river drives, booms, sawmills, wharves. Often they owned or had financial interest in the ships too. Samuel Vesey is the perfect example. Vesey started as a sailor, made money through clever trading, bought a ship, then bought more ships, then bought timberland, then sawmills, then the boom company, then a bank to finance all of it. By the peak of his career, Vesey controlled vast portions of the Maine lumber supply chain from forest to market. He owned 80 sawmills, thousands of acres of timber, the bank that financed other lumber operations. He even printed his own money, Vesey bucks, issued by his bank in the 1850s and 60s, used throughout the region. But when Vesey died in 1868, his fortune was estimated in the millions, tens of millions in modern money. And he wasn't unique. Abner Coburn, Rufus Dwinell, Ira Wadley, these men built similar empires. They bought entire townships, whole forests. controlled water rights, built dams to ensure their operations had priority during drives. They competed viciously, sometimes redirecting water to serve their own mills at the expense of competitors. They also collaborated to suppress wages, control prices, and maintain political power. The lumber barons built mansions in Bangor, elaborate Greek Revival and Victorian homes along Broadway, the city's showcase street. These weren't modest houses. They were statements. 3-story structures with columns, ornate woodwork, imported materials, multiple servants. Broadway was laid out in the 1820s and 30s specifically to attract Bangor's elite. Modeled after Boston's Beacon Hill, a green strip ran down the center for the first 2 blocks, planted with double rows of elm trees. The lumber barons competed to build the most impressive home, Isaac Farrar's mansion, designed by architect Richard Upjohn. The Zebulon Smith House, one of the earliest temple-front Greek Revival homes in Maine. Samuel Vesey's house at Broadway and York Street, built in 1833, enormous and ostentatious. Oliver Frost's Queen Anne on High Street. The wealth on display was staggering, especially when you considered where it came from. Logs cut by men earning $2 a day, floated down rivers by workers who drowned at rates. Companies didn't bother tracking. Processed in mills that maimed workers until they couldn't work anymore, and loaded onto ships by longshoremen paid barely enough to survive. The economic inequality was stark, brutal even by 19th century standards. The lumber barons accumulated fortunes measured in millions. The workers, loggers, river pigs, sawmill hands, longshoremen earned subsistence wages and died young. There was no middle ground. You either owned the operation or you were crushed by it. The statistics tell the story. Bangor's population exploded during the lumber boom, from 800 people in 1800 to 8,000 by 1830. By 1860, 14,500 residents. Most were working-class families drawn by the promise of lumber jobs. They lived in tenements, small houses, cramped conditions. Meanwhile, the lumber barons built mansions, funded churches, endowed libraries. Unserved in the legislature, Samuel Vesey was mayor of Bangor, served in both the State House and Senate. Hannibal Hamlin, vice president under Lincoln, was connected to Bangor's lumber aristocracy. The lumber barons didn't just control the economy, they controlled the politics. They shaped Maine's development to serve lumber interests, blocking railroad and infrastructure projects that might benefit other industries, keeping taxes low on timberland, ensuring their dominance continued as long as the trees lasted. But beyond the obvious wealth gap, there was a deeper transformation happening to Bangor itself. The city that existed in 1830 bore almost no resemblance to the city of 1860. Lumber money built everything. Streets were paved, gas lighting was installed, public buildings were constructed, schools, churches, and commercial blocks, all funded directly or indirectly by lumber profits. The Bangor Theological Seminary, founded in 1814, expanded with donations from lumber barons. Eastern Maine General Hospital, opened in 1892, was endowed by lumber wealth. These institutions served the entire community. Yes, but they existed because a small number of men extracted enormous fortunes from forests and decided to spend some of it locally. The workers who actually cut and processed the timber saw none of this wealth directly, but they benefited indirectly from the infrastructure it created. Better streets meant easier travel to work. Gaslighting meant safer evenings. Schools meant their children, if they could afford to send them, had educational opportunities. It was a strange bargain. The lumber industry destroyed workers' bodies and paid them barely enough to survive, and then used the profits to build a city those workers could live in but never afford to truly enjoy. The city's entire economy revolved around lumber. During peak season, every business in Bangor prospered. Boarding houses filled with workers. Taverns served longshoremen and ship crews. General stores sold supplies to lumber camps preparing for winter operations. Banks financed timber purchases and ship construction. Insurance companies underwrote vessels carrying lumber cargoes. Legal firms handled contracts, disputes, land sales. The entire commercial ecosystem existed to support one industry. When lumber was good, everything was good. When lumber slowed, the whole city suffered. This created a dangerous dependency. Bangor had no economic diversification, no manufacturing beyond sawmills, no agricultural base, no alternative industries of significant scale, just lumber. And everyone knew it. The lumber barons certainly knew it. That's why some of them diversified their investments. Samuel Vesey owned not just sawmills, but banks, railroads, real estate in other states. When the main timber ran out, he had other income sources. The workers had no such options. Their only skill was lumber work. When that disappeared, they had nothing. The social structure was rigid. At the top, lumber barons and associated wealthy families. Below them, professional class, lawyers, doctors, merchants, ship captains who'd done well. Below that, skilled workers, sawmill foremen, ship carpenters, experienced longshoremen. At the bottom, unskilled labor, general mill hands, casual dock workers, camp laborers. Movement between classes was rare but possible. A smart longshoreman could become a foreman. A foreman might save enough to invest in a small operation. But these were exceptions. Most workers stayed workers until they couldn't work anymore. And the system was designed to keep it that way. Low wages prevented accumulation of capital. Seasonal work meant no steady income to save. Dangerous conditions meant careers ended through injury or death long before a man could build anything. The lumber barons preferred it this way. Desperate workers don't organize. They don't demand better conditions. They accept what's offered because the alternative is starvation. That fear kept the whole system functioning smoothly for decades. There were attempts at organizing, small strikes, work stoppages, demands for better pay or safer conditions. The lumber barons crushed them all, sometimes through replacement workers, sometimes through political pressure, sometimes through violence. In 1861, for instance, a mob attacked the Bangor Daily Union, a newspaper whose editor held Southern sympathies. This wasn't labor organizing, but it showed how quickly mob action could be mobilized when interests aligned. The lumber barons understood this. They understood power, and they used it ruthlessly to protect their profits. If workers struck, the barons would wait them out. Workers needed wages to eat. The barons had reserves that could last months or years. Eventually, hunger forced the workers back, usually at the same or lower wages. The message was clear: you have no leverage. You will accept what we offer, or you will starve. And for the most part, workers accepted it. Because they hadn't families. Because they had no other options. Because the system was designed to give them no choice. The human cost of all this was enormous. We'll never know the exact number, but scattered records suggest hundreds of workers died in sawmill accidents in Bangor alone between 1830 and 1890, crushed by logs, mangled by saws, scalded by steam, killed by machinery that had no safety features because safety cost money and slowed production. Most deaths went unrecorded. When a worker died, his body was removed, his family was given nothing, and a new worker was hired by the end of the day. If the death was particularly dramatic, man decapitated by a saw blade, worker pulled into machinery and torn apart, it might get a brief mention in the newspaper, a single paragraph. No name, just a mill worker or a laborer. Anonymous. Forgotten. The lumber had to keep moving. Production couldn't stop for one dead man. The mills ran 24 hours a day. There were always more workers available. The supply was endless. The waste was acceptable. These men didn't have YouTube channels. They didn't have anyone telling their story. We're changing that. If you believe their sacrifice deserves to be known, hit subscribe. You're part of something bigger now. Nobody was filming when these workers lost their lives in the mills. No one documented their courage, their desperation, their willingness to risk everything for wages that barely fed their families. But we are now. We're making sure their memory doesn't disappear. Subscribe if you think that matters. Help us keep their legacy alive. Beyond the deaths, there was the ecological devastation. As between 1832 and 1888, Just 56 years, Bangor shipped 8.7 billion board feet of lumber. That's verified, surveyed, documented. To put that in perspective, 1 billion board feet equals roughly 120,000 acres of forest cut to the ground. 8.7 billion board feet means over 1 million acres, an entire 1 million acres of white pine forest. Gone, stripped, turned into lumber, and shipped away. The actual number was higher because the 8.7 billion only counts surveyed lumber. It doesn't include logs lost in drives, timber that jammed and rotted, wood processed but not shipped, trees cut but abandoned because they weren't profitable. The real harvest probably exceeded 10 billion board feet, closer to 1.2 million acres. That's 1,875 square miles of forest. For context, the state of Rhode Island is 1,214 square miles. Bangor's lumber industry cut down more forest than the entire area of Rhode Island in half a century, all floated down one river, all processed in one city, all shipped from one port. The environmental impact was catastrophic. The Penobscot River and its tributaries were damaged permanently. Log drives tore up stream beds, destroyed salmon spawning grounds, filled rivers with bark and debris. The water quality declined. Pollution from sawmills, sawdust, chemicals, waste contaminated the river. By the late 1800s, the Penobscot and Kenduskeag were severely polluted. Fish populations crashed. The forests themselves changed character. White pine was the premium species. Straight, tall, perfect for lumber. Loggers cut it preferentially. After the white pine was gone, they moved to spruce, then other species. The original forest, old-growth white pine, 200, 300 years old, never cut since before European settlement, was completely eliminated from northern Maine. What grew back was different, younger, less valuable. The logging frontier moved north and west as accessible timber disappeared. By the 1880s, the boom was ending, not because demand decreased, because the supply ran out. The decline happened fast. In 1860, Bangor shipped 150 million board feet annually. By 1890, the number had dropped to a fraction of that. The best timber was gone. New railroads made it possible to ship lumber from other regions, Michigan, Wisconsin, the Pacific Northwest, that hadn't been logged yet. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869, opened western markets that didn't need Maine lumber anymore. Bangor's dominance evaporated within a decade, so the sawmills started closing. The ships stopped coming, the population stabilized, then declined as workers left for opportunities elsewhere. The lumber barons saw it coming and diversified, invested in railroads, banks, other industries. Some moved west to continue logging in virgin forests. The workers had no such options. The sawmills that employed them shut down. The longshoremen work disappeared. The seasonal logging jobs dried up. Many families who'd moved to Bangor for lumber work found themselves trapped. Skills that had value in 1860, sawmill work, river driving, loading lumber, were worthless by 1900. Entire communities built around the lumber industry collapsed when the industry left. By 1900, Bangor had transitioned. Paper mills replaced sawmills. The economy shifted from lumber production to pulp and paper manufacturing. This required different labor, less skilled, more mechanized, lower paid. The river was still used for log transport, but the logs now went to paper mills, not sawmills. The spring drives continued into the early 1900s. The last major log drive on the Penobscot happened in 1972, when new environmental regulations, the Clean Water Act, finally ended the practice. By then, it was a relic. Roads and trucks had replaced rivers and booms. The entire system that made Bangor the lumber capital of the world was obsolete. The infrastructure slowly disappeared. Mills were torn down or converted. The booms were removed. The docks rotted. Broadway's mansions remained, now landmarks of an era when lumber created vast wealth and destroyed an equal amount of forest and human life. But before that transition was complete, Bangor faced a catastrophe that physically destroyed much of what the lumber era had built. The Great Fire of 1911. On April 30th, 1911, a fire started in a shed on Broad Street. High winds spread it rapidly through downtown Bangor. The fire burned for 12 hours. By the time it was extinguished, 55 acres of the city center had been destroyed. Nearly 100 businesses gone, 6 churches, 1 synagogue, the high school, post office, public library, telephone and telegraph companies, banks, 2 fire stations, 285 private residences. The damage was estimated at $3 to $5 million, roughly 95 to 160 million in modern money. Nobody died, remarkably, but thousands were left homeless or jobless overnight. The fire destroyed the commercial heart of Bangor. All the businesses that had thrived on lumber trade, gone. And the infrastructure that supported the industry, gone. What remained were the Broadway mansions, most of which sat far enough from the fire zone to survive, and the memory of what the city had been. The rebuilding happened quickly. Within months, new construction began. But the rebuilt Bangor was different, less dependent on lumber, more diverse economically. The fire had destroyed the old structures and old ways of doing business. What replaced them was more modern, more industrial, more connected to the changing economy of the early 20th century. Bangor Hydroelectric Company, founded just before the fire, became a major power player. Its owner, John R. Graham, was one of the primary drivers of reconstruction, building 7 new structures including a modern electrical substation. The new downtown featured brick and concrete buildings instead of wooden structures, fireproof construction, modern design. It was a city rebuilt for a new century, not the lumber era it was leaving behind. For the workers who depended on lumber jobs, the transition was brutal. Sawmill work didn't translate to paper mill work, or electrical work, or the new industries emerging. Men in their 40s and 50s who'd spent their entire adult lives in sawmills found themselves unemployable. Too old to learn new trades, too broken physically to do heavy labor, too poor to start businesses. Many left Bangor entirely, moving to wherever work was available. Others stayed and struggled, taking whatever occasional work they could find, surviving on charity or family support. Their children had better options. They could enter the new industries. I get educated, find different paths. But for the generation that built Bangor's lumber industry, the end was often poverty and obscurity. They'd given their youth, their health, their lives to an industry that discarded them the moment they weren't profitable. And when that industry died, they died with it. Economically, if not literally. The lumber barons fared better naturally. Most had diversified before the collapse. William Engel, one of the major lumber barons of the late 1800s, owned lumber operations across Maine and Canada, but also invested in real estate, banks, and other industries. When he died in 1900, he left over $1 million to his wife and daughter, roughly $35 million in modern money. Terence Francis Cassidy, another major figure, started as a blacksmith and built a business empire that included ship's chandlery, manufacturing, real estate. Both men, one a German Jewish immigrant, one Irish Catholic, overcame poverty and prejudice to succeed in Protestant-dominated Bangor. Both accumulated fortunes from lumber. Both left substantial legacies. Their names are remembered, their contributions acknowledged. Meanwhile, the thousands of anonymous workers who made their fortunes possible, the men who cut the trees, drove the logs, ran the saws, loaded the ships, are forgotten. No memorials, no statues, just scattered records and the occasional mention in old newspapers when someone died in a particularly dramatic accident. Today, Bangor is a city of about 33,000 people. The Penobscot River is cleaner than it was in 1890. Salmon populations are recovering slowly. The forests have regrown, though they'll never match the old growth that was clear-cut. A few reminders of the lumber era persist. The 31-foot statue of Paul Bunyan near the Bangor Auditorium, erected in 1959 to celebrate the city's logging history. The Broadway Historic District, where lumber baron mansions still stand, protected as historic landmarks. the Patton Lumbermen's Museum, 100 miles north, preserving tools, photographs, and stories from the logging camps. Mount Hope Cemetery, where Samuel Vesey's tomb sits alongside other lumber barons who shaped Maine's economy and politics for half a century. These are fragments, remnants. Most of the actual history, the work, the danger, the human cost, exists only in scattered records, old photographs, and family stories that get passed down until they're forgotten. The economic transformation from lumber capital to modern city wasn't smooth. Bangor struggled for decades after the lumber boom ended. Population declined, businesses closed. The prosperity that seemed permanent in 1860 evaporated by 1900. What saved Bangor was diversification that should have happened earlier but was blocked by lumber barons protecting their interests. Paper mills emerged as the primary industry by 1910. Bangor Hydroelectric provided power for new manufacturing. The Bangor and Aroostook Railroad, completed in the 1890s, connected northern Maine to markets and opened new economic opportunities beyond lumber. Eastern Maine General Hospital became a regional medical center. The University of Maine, founded in Orono, just upriver in 1865, grew into a major educational institution. Slowly, painfully, Bangor built an economy that didn't depend on extracting and shipping a single resource. It took generations. The workers displaced by lumber's decline mostly didn't benefit. Their children and grandchildren did. By the mid-20th century, Bangor had become a stable, diversified, small city. Not wealthy like the lumber boom years, but sustainable in ways the lumber economy never was. The lessons from Bangor's lumber era are uncomfortable. They show how extraction economies work: concentrate wealth, exploit labor, destroy resources, move on when they're depleted. The lumber barons understood this perfectly. They made fortunes by privatizing the gains and externalizing the costs. Workers paid the cost in destroyed bodies and poverty wages. The forest paid the cost in permanent ecosystem damage. Future generations paid the cost in lost resources. The barons took their wealth and invested it elsewhere or passed it to descendants who never touched a saw or loaded a ship. The system worked beautifully for them. It was designed to. And Bangor participated willingly because the alternative, no lumber industry, meant no city at all. Remote location. No natural resources except timber. No reason for anyone to be there except to extract logs and ship them elsewhere. The city existed because the industry existed. When the industry changed, the city had to change or die. It chose to change. Barely. After tremendous suffering and loss. What's remarkable is that Bangor survived it all. Most lumber boom towns didn't. Across Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, states that followed Maine's pattern, lumber towns appeared, thrived briefly, and vanished when the timber ran out. Ghost towns now. Or tiny remnants of former populations. Bangor survived because it had advantages. The Penobscot River didn't stop being useful when lumber ended. The location remained strategic. The railroad connections supported other industries. The University of Maine provided educational and research infrastructure. The paper mills, while less profitable than lumber, still employed thousands. And the lumber barons' infrastructure investments, schools, hospitals, banks, created institutional foundations that outlasted the industry that built them. Bangor got lucky, and it paid an enormous price for that luck. 1 million acres of forest gone, hundreds of workers dead, decades of extractive economics that left most people poorer than when they started. But the city survived. That counts for something. Not much, but something. The forests that fed Bangor's lumber mills are partially regrown now. Second growth, third growth in some areas. Trees that are 80, 100, maybe 120 years old, replacing forests that were 200, 300 years old when they were cut. The ecology is different, fewer old growth species, more diverse age structure, different wildlife patterns. The rivers still flow, but they flow through landscapes fundamentally altered by logging. Stream beds changed by log drives, watersheds modified by 19th century dams, soil composition different from centuries of disturbance. Ecologists call it legacy effects, changes so profound they persist for centuries after the activity that caused them stops. Maine's forests will show legacy effects from the 19th century, logging for another 200 years. Maybe longer. The trees will grow back, yes. But the forest that returns won't be the forest that was there. That forest is gone forever. Bangor shipped it around the world, built cities with it, turned it into houses that are themselves gone now. The timber cut in 1850 and shipped to Boston to build warehouses that burned down in 1900. The resource used to create temporary structures that outlasted the workers who created them, but not by much. Enormous effort, enormous destruction. For temporary benefit, that's the math of extraction. Permanent damage for temporary gain. What's worth remembering is the scale. 8.7 billion board feet of lumber, 3,000 ships in one harbor, 150 sawmills running simultaneously, hundreds of workers killed in accidents that nobody bothered to document, 1 million acres of forest turned into boards and shipped around the world. When an entire city built on the premise that natural resources are infinite, that labor is expendable, that profit justifies any human or environmental cost. Bangor in 1860 was the logical endpoint of that premise, the place where all the logs ended up, the terminus of the most destructive and profitable lumber operation in American history. Every log that survived the winter cut, the spring drive, the jams, the rapids, the drownings, all of it ended here, sorted at the boom, sawed in the mills, loaded onto ships, shipped to markets that turned Maine white pine into the houses, buildings, and infrastructure of 19th century America. If you want to go deeper into these stories, if you want early access to videos before anyone else sees them, join the membership. It's for people who don't just watch history, they carry it forward. The lumber barons left behind mansions and fortunes. The workers left behind unmarked graves and forgotten names. Our members help make sure both sides of the story get told. If you want to be part of that, if you want to join the inner circle of people keeping these stories alive, the membership link is in the description. Early access to videos, behind-the-scenes research, the chance to help decide what stories we tell next. Check it out. The thing about Bangor is that it proves something uncomfortable. American prosperity was built on extraction, of resources, of labor, of forests that took centuries to grow and decades to destroy. The lumber barons understood this. They extracted wealth from Maine's forests, accumulated it, and left before the resource ran out. They died rich. They're remembered in street names, town names, like cemetery monuments. The workers who cut the trees, drove the logs, ran the saws, loaded the ships, they're mostly forgotten. No monuments, no street names, just statistics in old records, numbers in survey documents, brief mentions in newspaper articles about mill accidents. The system worked exactly as designed: maximum profit, minimum cost, externalize the damage, environmental, human, social. When the trees ran out, move on. Find new forests, repeat. Bangor wasn't unique in this, but it was the most successful example of the model, the world's largest lumber port, the place where 1 million acres of forest became 8.7 billion board feet of product, the destination of every log that survived the journey, the end of the line for timber and the men who moved it. If you stand at Bangor's waterfront today, you can still see the Penobscot River. It looks peaceful, clean, a few recreational boats. No lumber schooners, no packed harbor, no noise from 150 sawmills running at capacity. The Broadway mansions are still there, beautifully maintained, some converted to museums or offices. The lumber barons' legacies are preserved, but the river doesn't remember the log drives. The docks don't remember the workers who loaded 3,300 ships in a single year. The mills are gone, the booms are gone, the forest that fed it all is gone. What remains is the knowledge that this happened, that for half a century, Bangor was the center of an industry that transformed America and destroyed a forest ecosystem that had existed for thousands of years, that hundreds of men died making it possible, that vast fortunes were built on their labor, that we remember the barons and forget the workers. History does that, remembers the powerful, forgets the expendable, unless we choose not to, unless we make the effort to tell the whole story. Not just the impressive statistics, 8.7 billion board feet, 3,000 ships, 150 sawmills, but the human cost behind those numbers. The sawmill worker who lost both feet and kept working until he physically couldn't. The longshoreman who carried boards for $1.50 a day and died poor. The river pig who drowned in a jam and wasn't identified for a week. The logger who cut trees all winter for wages that barely fed his family. These men built the lumber industry. They made Bangor the world's lumber capital. They died doing it. Their names aren't on mansions or cemetery monuments, but their work shaped America. The houses we live in, the cities we inhabit, the economy we inherited. All of it traces back, in part, to forests in Maine and men who cut them down for subsistence wages and shipped them through one crowded harbor where lumber barons became millionaires and workers became statistics. That's the legacy of Bangor, not just the impressive scale of the operation, but the brutal economics that made it possible. The willingness to sacrifice forests, workers, and future sustainability for immediate profit, the industry that ran on extraction until there was nothing left to extract, then moved on and left the cleanup to someone else. Bangor proved it worked, for a while, until it didn't. The forest is gone, the workers are gone. The industry is gone. What remains are stories, and the question of whether we'll remember them, or let them disappear like everything else.